By 1955, U.S. war planners were staring down a terrifying new problem. The Soviets had built submarines that could dive deeper than any weapon could reach. If they hid thousands of feet down with nuclear missiles on board, America would have no way to stop them. So the Navy greenlit something no one had ever tried: a live nuclear detonation, 2,000 feet underwater. The Soviet Union had built submarines that posed an unprecedented threat to American naval forces. U.S. planners worried these submarines might operate beyond the 300-foot range where depth charges and torpedoes could effectively reach them. This created a problem that kept military planners awake at night. The deeper these submarines could go, the harder they became to find and destroy. Traditional weapons had serious limits. The U.S. Navy realized that Soviet submarines could simply dive below these weapons and become practically invisible. They could hide in deep ocean trenches and wait for the perfect moment to strike. The strategic implications were terrifying. Soviet submarines equipped with nuclear weapons could position themselves thousands of feet underwater near American coastlines. They could launch attacks against cities, military bases, and naval fleets without warning. The entire U.S. surface fleet, including aircraft carriers and battleships worth billions of dollars, would be sitting targets if enemy submarines could operate safely in deep water. Military commanders knew they needed a weapon that could reach submarines at any depth. Nuclear weapons seemed like the logical solution. A nuclear bomb could theoretically destroy everything within a massive radius, regardless of how deep the target was hiding. But nobody actually knew if nuclear weapons would work underwater. The U.S. had tested nuclear bombs in the air and on land, but water is completely different. Water is 800 times denser than air and doesn't compress the same way, making shockwave behavior and radiation spread unpredictable. Scientists had theories about what might happen, but theories don't win wars. Would the water absorb the blast and make it weaker, or focus the energy and make it stronger? How far would the shock waves travel through the ocean? Would submarines at different depths react differently to the same explosion? These questions had no answers because nobody had ever detonated a nuclear weapon in deep water. The uncertainty created a dangerous gap in American military planning. If the U.S. couldn't effectively destroy Soviet submarines hiding in deep water, then the entire strategy for defending America's coastlines would need to change. The Navy would have to assume that enemy submarines could operate freely in the deep ocean. This would require massive changes to how they positioned their fleets and protected their ships. The pressure to find an answer grew stronger as the Cold War intensified. After years of debate, military leaders made a decision that had never been attempted before in human history. They would detonate a nuclear weapon 2,000 feet underwater in the Pacific Ocean. But first, they had to figure out how to actually do it. The military faced engineering challenges that no one had ever tried to solve before. They needed to get a nuclear weapon down to exactly 2,000 feet underwater and detonate it at the right moment. This wasn't like dropping a bomb from an airplane or setting it off on land. Water pressure at that depth would crush most equipment in seconds. The weapon they chose was the Mark 90 Betty, a nuclear depth bomb with a yield of 30 kilotons. This made it more than twice as powerful as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The entire device had to be sealed inside a water and pressure-proof steel shell that could handle the enormous pressure found 2,000 feet below the ocean's surface. The bomb would be suspended from the USS Tawasa by a steel cable and lowered to the precise depth needed for the test. Finding the right location took months of planning. The military picked a spot 500 miles southwest of San Diego. This distance put the test far away from shipping lanes where commercial vessels might accidentally sail into the area. It also kept the test away from populated coastlines, where people might be affected by radiation or the blast effects, and the planners calculated this location down to the minute to make sure everything was positioned correctly. Hydrographic surveys by the Scripps Institution showed the area had favorable low-current conditions, making it ideal for the test. The logistics of Operation Wigwam involved coordinating 6,800 military personnel spread across 30 different ships. Joint Task Force 7 took control of the entire operation under the direction of the Chief of Naval Operations. Each ship had specific roles and positions they needed to maintain during the test. Weather presented constant problems during the preparation phase. High winds and rough seas damaged equipment and broke instrument cables. The harsh conditions exceeded even the worst-case scenarios the planners had prepared for. Air hoses ruptured, pontoons filled with water, and chains snapped under the stress. Repair crews worked around the clock to fix the problems, but the weather forced them to postpone the test from May 11th to May 14th. Equipment failure was a constant concern. If any part of the detonation system failed, years of planning and millions of dollars would be wasted. The nuclear device had to be armed and triggered remotely from a safe distance, which meant every electrical connection had to work perfectly under extreme pressure and in salt water. Planning for Operation Wigwam started almost 5 years before the actual test. The Armed Forces Special Weapons Project had studied the problem extensively and concluded that a nuclear anti-submarine weapon was needed as soon as possible. The pre-operational phase ran from November 15, 1954, to March 31, 1955. The operational phase began on April 1, 1955, and continued through May 28. But the bomb was only part of the equation. The military still needed a way to measure exactly what the nuclear explosion would do to enemy submarines at different distances. The military built 3 unmanned target submarines called SQUAWs to serve as nuclear test dummies. Each squaw was a 4/5 scale USS Tang prototype, 132 feet long, made of 1-inch high tensile steel, designed to collapse at about 1,465 feet. This ensured accurate shock response data. The military chose this design because intelligence reports suggested it matched the capabilities of modern Soviet submarines that could dive to dangerous depths. The Long Beach Naval Shipyard began construction early in 1954. Engineers fitted the targets with internal framing, capsule ends, and kept structural discontinuities to a minimum. This construction method was designed to provide accurate data about how shock waves would affect real submarines. Scale model tests of structural strength were conducted at Kanawha Gulf, Haiti, by the Underwater Explosion Research Division from 1952 through late spring of 1954. These tests showed that the crown of the hulls above the ballast tanks needed additional strengthening. Each squaw was packed with scientific instruments that had never been tested under these conditions. Pressure sensors, accelerometers, and filming equipment were installed throughout the targets. The instruments were connected to instrument barges through cable bundles that had to transmit signals from the gauges to the recording equipment. The cameras had to capture footage of a nuclear explosion underwater while being hit by massive shock waves. Nobody knew if any of this equipment would survive long enough to record useful data. The positioning of the 3 targets was critical for gathering comprehensive data. The 3 identical squaw units bracketed ranges at 5,200 feet, 7,300 feet, and 11,000 feet to determine lethal radius. Squaw 12 was placed closest to the blast, Squaw 13 at medium range, and Squaw 29 furthest away. This arrangement was designed to bracket the expected lethal range of the nuclear weapon and show how damage varied at different distances. Each squaw was supported by 8 80-ton pontoons by USS Tawassa with 6-mile tow lines. During surface towing, the pontoons were streamed behind the squaw. When the ballast tanks were flooded, the target sank to a position directly beneath the pontoons in what engineers called a double bifiller suspension. The goal was to determine exactly how close a submarine could be to a nuclear explosion and still survive. The military needed to know if depth charges were obsolete and whether nuclear weapons could reliably destroy submarines hiding in deep water. If the instruments failed or the data was unclear, years of planning and millions of dollars would be wasted. The entire future of anti-submarine warfare depended on what these three targets would reveal. On May 14, 1955, at exactly 1 p.m. Pacific time, everything was in position. The Mark 90 Betty hung 2,000 feet below the surface, ready to detonate. The moment the detonation occurred, it created effects that no human had ever witnessed before. The 30-kiloton explosion generated pressure waves equivalent to 46 million pounds of TNT at distances greater than 1,000 feet, measurements that would later be confirmed by Project One data analysis. The shock wave traveled through the water faster than sound, creating a massive bubble of superheated gas and steam that expanded outward in all directions with a bubble period of 2.83 seconds. Squaw 12, positioned closest to the blast at 5,200 feet away, was instantly crushed by the shock wave. The target submarine collapsed and flooded within seconds of the explosion. The pressure hull, built with 1-inch high-tensile steel and designed to withstand normal submarine operations, crumpled under the force of the underwater nuclear blast. The test data confirmed that any hull would collapse if positioned closer than 7,000 feet from a 30-kiloton explosion at 2,000-foot depth. All the scientific instruments packed inside Squaw 12 were destroyed, providing crucial data about the weapon's destructive capabilities. The explosion created a spray dome on the ocean surface that reached a maximum diameter of 15,000 feet. Despite the bomb being detonated 2,000 feet below the surface, the blast effects shot upward through the water and created enormous walls of water and steam. The first plume of water and debris reached a height of 1,410 feet above the ocean surface. A second dome formed after the first one, followed by individual water spikes that shot up to 600 feet high. The surface wave measurements showed a range times height product of 210,000, significantly exceeding the predicted value of 80,000. Ships positioned miles away from the detonation point were hit by the surface effects. The YFNB-12 instrument barge, located 5,500 feet from the blast, experienced a vertical displacement of 37 feet as massive waves passed underneath it. Vessels carrying thousands of sailors were rocked by the shock waves that traveled through the water and reached the surface. Many sailors reported feeling the ship suddenly jolt or shake without any warning or explanation. The radioactive materials from the explosion began dispersing through the water in patterns that scientists could only guess at beforehand. The major explosion plumes were heavily contaminated with radioactive particles. The base surge, made up of fine water droplets, spread contamination about 5,000 feet across and upwind from the detonation point. The total radiation dose at the blast site was 3,600 Roentgens. 5 miles downwind, the contamination level reached 400 Roentgens per hour within just 18 minutes of the explosion. Squaw 13, positioned at medium range, sustained severe damage but remained on the surface. This target provided scientists with the most useful data because it showed the exact point where submarines would be badly damaged but not completely destroyed. Squaw 29, furthest from the blast, remained mostly intact and continued floating normally. The test results were clear and shocking. The ocean's depth provided almost no protection against nuclear weapons. A submarine at 250 feet depth would be completely destroyed if it came within 7,000 feet of a 30-kiloton nuclear blast. The water that submarines relied on for protection actually made the explosion more deadly by transmitting the shock waves more efficiently than air. But the scientific success of Operation Wigwam would soon be overshadowed by questions about what the test had done to the thousands of servicemen who witnessed it. Radiation exposure became a serious concern for the thousands of servicemen who participated in the test. While few servicemen lacked dosimeters during the operation, the 4 DT-60 dosimeters that were recovered showed radiation levels of 3,600 roentgens at the blast site. This measurement confirmed that the explosion had created extremely dangerous conditions in the immediate area around the detonation. Confidential government documents that surfaced years later revealed that the servicemen were subjected to what officials called extremely hazardous respiratory conditions. The men breathed in radioactive particles from the contaminated water droplets and steam that spread across the test area. The base surge from the explosion carried fine radioactive materials that drifted over the ships and their crews. Many sailors had no protective equipment and no warning about what they were breathing. The government kept these health risks classified for over 20 years, while veterans began developing mysterious illnesses. Men who had been healthy young sailors started getting sick with cancers, blood disorders, and other serious medical problems. They had no idea that their symptoms might be connected to Operation Wigwam because the military never told them they had participated in a nuclear test. Ship logs from vessels involved in the operation told a very different story than what the Navy claimed publicly. These records showed that some vessels were positioned much closer to the bomb detonation than the Navy admitted, despite official claims that no servicemen were closer than 5 miles from the blast. This discrepancy in distance meant that some crew members were exposed to much higher levels of radiation than the military acknowledged. The delayed notification and lack of immediate medical monitoring meant that radiation-related conditions went undetected in many veterans. The disease had spread through their bodies, while they had no idea that their military service had put them at risk for serious health problems. Veterans who developed illnesses years later had no way to prove their conditions were connected to the nuclear test. The Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory conducted long-term monitoring studies of personnel exposure levels. These studies were part of broader efforts to understand the health effects of nuclear testing that would eventually contribute to discussions about the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The scientific data collected from Operation Wigwam helped establish protocols for future nuclear operations. But the human cost of gathering this information remained largely hidden from public view. The health crisis surrounding Operation Wigwam exposed fundamental questions about how military leaders balanced scientific objectives against the safety of their own personnel. The test had achieved its primary goal of determining whether submarines could survive nuclear attacks in deep water. But the full consequences of that success would not be understood for decades. Operation Wigwam delivered definitive answers about submarine vulnerability in deep water. The test results showed that depth provided minimal protection. Submarines at 250-foot depth would be destroyed within 7,000 feet of a 30-kiloton blast. Military planners on both sides had to completely rethink how they would use submarines in future conflicts. The test's legacy remains complicated. It was a scientific breakthrough that answered critical questions about underwater nuclear weapons and shaped submarine tactics for decades. But this success came at significant cost to the servicemen who participated while the government kept health risks classified for over 20 years. Today, Operation Wigwam remains the only U.S. nuclear test conducted in deep ocean water beyond 1,000 feet. What do you think about how this single test changed naval strategy during the Cold War? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to follow the story of Operation Crossroads, check out our video here.